On the 4th of May 1917, less than a month after their official declaration of war, the first Americans entered the combat zone in Ireland, when 6 United States destroyers under Commander Joseph Taussig steamed into Cork Harbour on the island's south coast. Reporting to the Royal Navy in Queenstown, now Cove, Taussig was asked when he could have his ships ready for duty. Famously, he is said to have responded, "We're ready now, sir." Over the following weeks and months, thousands of Taussig's fellow countrymen would follow him. Before long, there would be upwards of 6,000 naval servicemen in and about Cork, with anything up to 100 vessels in the harbour. These included not only destroyers, but also specialised ships such as sub-chasers and submarines. Aside from the major naval presence, concentrated entirely in Cork Harbour and Bantry Bay, there were also United States naval air stations, where Curtiss H-16 flying boats operated. Aside from 2 located in Cork, there were also air stations at Wexford and in Lough Foyle in County Donegal. In addition, the US Navy also maintained a storehouse facility in the Dublin docks. The role of the American Navy in Ireland during the First World War was a crucial one, as the Germans had reopened unrestricted submarine warfare around Britain by this point in the war. The Americans' role was twofold: to assist in conveying American doughboys from the United States to the Western Front, and most importantly, to protect shipping and actively seek to disrupt U-boat activity in the area off southwest Ireland, known as the Western Approaches. The United States Navy spent some 2 years in Ireland, departing in mid-1919. Though they didn't lose large numbers of men to combat during this time, they were impacted by the influenza epidemic which swept Europe. Cork Harbour was also the location of US Naval Hospital No. 4, staffed by medical personnel from Rhode Island. Influenza had actually broken out on their ship as they made their way to Ireland in 1918, and it occupied the majority of their time once they got there. US nurse Grace McIntyre described how widespread influenza was at the base. "Our patients came from the torpedo base across the harbour from us, from the air station at Ahada, from the passage barracks, from the air station and pigeon carrier station at Whiddy Island, and from our own ships in the harbour. There were 2 large ships, the Dixie and the Melville, and many smaller boats stationed in the harbour near us during our stay in Queenstown. Through the worst part of the epidemic, we loaned a few of our nurses to the British Naval Hospital across the harbour at Haulbowline. They had a hospital of 80 beds and only 2 graduate nurses. However, they had 12 splendid VADs. This hospital had cared for our sick men before we had arrived, and we were only too glad to be able to be of service to them. We also sent 2 of our nurses to Whiddy Island to care for a few patients who were too ill to be brought to us at White Point." The Americans had arrived in Ireland in May 1917, just over a year after the events of the Easter Rising. The American sailors thought that they were entering an allied country that was fully supportive of their efforts. But in many respects, Cork was now a divided county, split between those who supported the war effort and those who were vehemently opposed to it. Though thousands of Cork men were serving in the First World War, many young men around the county had stayed at home and were members of the nationalist Irish Volunteers. An example of the divisions can be seen in the experience of Thomas Culhane, a Cork member of the Irish Volunteers. About July 1916, I took part in a parade to Charleville railway station to welcome home the released 1916 rising prisoners. Sean O'Dea, company captain, and others. We were attacked by a hostile mob on returning to town, composed of British soldiers' wives and relatives. But this mob came out second best. Although the 1916 rising in Cork had largely been abortive, the Irish Volunteers were well represented in the county, and there had been roundups of some of their leading members after the events in Dublin. Many of the locations where the Americans were based were hotbeds of volunteer activity, and in fact, many of these volunteers had actually worked for the British Naval Service in and around Cork Harbour. One of the volunteers who worked for the British Navy on Haulbowline Island was Seamus Fitzgerald. He remembered what occurred to him after the 1916 rising. On Tuesday, May the 3rd at 11 a.m, I was instructed to cease working at my lathe and report at the Chief Engineer's office. He presented me to the local district inspector of the RIC. He asked if I were secretary of the Sinn Féin volunteers in Queenstown. I said that we were called our movement the Irish Volunteers, and that I was secretary of the Cove unit. He asked where my rifle was, and I told him that I had not a rifle. After further stating that I had no arms or ammunition at my house, he said that he would have to detain me under martial law, and his accompanying sergeant handcuffed me on his instructions. I was conveyed under arrest in a launch to Cove and on to Cork by train. This was the community in which the American sailors found themselves living from 1917. For their part, the Americans were quick to notice the number of young men not in uniform, who often loudly expressed sympathy for both Germany and Sinn Féin. One way in which we can determine their reactions to this and other experiences is in a review of the letters they wrote home to the United States, which were often printed in local newspapers, and which I've been seeking to explore. One was written by William Hoffman, who was serving aboard USS Oklahoma, later sunk at Pearl Harbour, but he was in Bantry Bay in 1918 when he wrote the following lines. Well, I am in Ireland. Our base has been here in Bantry Bay since we came across to this side. It is, as you can see on the map, in the southern part of Ireland. It lies between high mountains which are in every direction you look. Before the US entered the war, it was a German submarine base, and the Irish supplied them with provisions, etc., as a good many of them were in sympathy with Germany. But now it is an American naval base, and there are battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, sub-chasers, minesweepers and layers, and all other kinds of vessels here. Caesar Seachy, who served aboard the submarine tender USS Bushnell, went so far as to fabricate a story about combat with the local Irish nationalists, published under the headline Tall Tales in the Wilmington Morning News. Did you read in the papers that the USS Bushnell and submarines had a landing party in Ireland? You see, where we are, there are a bunch of people called Sinn Féin. They started some trouble in the town. We were the only ships in there, so the Admiral in London said to have a landing party. As soon as we got the word, we were all ready with guns and bayonets. There were 400 of us rowed up there. As soon as we got near the dock, they started to throw rocks and hoot us. There were 24 killed and 31 wounded, but we killed nearly all of them, about 600. It lasted for 5 hours, and boy, I was scared for a while, for it was the first time I was ever in a battle. We put boxes, wagons, rocks, chains and everything in front of us. We chased the rest of them out of town. After that, the Irish people invited us to their homes and gave us Irish whiskey, stout and fresh eggs. Well, it happened again, but this time they only threw stones at us. What marks both of these accounts out is that neither of them are true. Bantry Bay had not been a German base before the war, and there was no major violent altercation that led to the deaths of hundreds of people in and around Bantry Bay. But these letters do tell us something about the wider fractures that were present within the local society. Aside from issues with supporting the war effort, we also have to recognise that there was often an extreme social and cultural gulf between the Irish locals and American sailors. This is something we see referenced again and again in sailors' correspondence, even those who were Irish American. Let's return to William Hoffman, who had his letter home published in the North Carolina Lincoln County News. The country of Ireland is beautiful. It is always green and is terraced in plots or squares, so that it looks exactly like a checkerboard. There are very few trees, and it rains about 9 out of every 10 days. The people seem odd and talk funny. You can't hardly understand a word they say. Their shoes are very thick and heavy, many of them have iron soles, and the women most always wear shawls. Most of the horses and mules are very small, and their buggies or carts have seats on the sides and are much higher from the ground than ours. And their trains are just like toys beside those in America. There are many saloons, but it is a very serious offence for an American sailor to get drunk, and the very few that do are severely dealt with. I don't see how the people live around here, as their gardens are very small. They raise lots of sheep and cattle. There are many old castles and things of that kind to see. Thomas Bednar, who was stationed in Cork Harbour, had the following to say. About a half-mile from the Lub, we had a dance auditorium. All civilians are excluded. The ship's orchestra usually plays only American dance music, but once in a while they strike up an Irish tune, and then believe me, the colleens are right there to whirl us around. These are about the only amusement places. If we do not feel like attending any of these, we take long walks and visit some of the queer old villages. No streetcars are seen around here. In some of the places, they never saw a Yank before. As soon as they see one or a group of us passing, there's a general popping of heads out of the windows, as if there was a circus coming. Lieutenant John Hurley's letter was published in the Fitchburg Sentinel in Massachusetts. After seeing how people have to live in this part of the world and what little they have to be glad about, I am fully convinced that a man in the States, even working for a salary, is better off than a man with money over here, at least as far as enjoying life is concerned. When discussing the First World War American presence in Ireland, it's important for us to consider the political, social and cultural challenges that both the Irish and Americans faced and felt from 1917 onwards, particularly in Cork. To that we can add another dimension, that of moral conservatism. Rural Ireland during this period was devoutly Catholic in outlook, with social conventions with respect to male and female relationships that were unfamiliar to large numbers of American servicemen. With that background in place, I want to spend the remainder of the podcast looking specifically about these interactions between American sailors and local women. Those interactions that resulted in these Irish war brides. On the 29th of September 1917, 148 days after the first American vessels had sailed into Cork Harbour, opening their participation in the First World War, 25-year-old Madge Ring married Pennsylvanian Harry Weed in County Cork. Harry was a sailor aboard USS Allen, a vessel that had been in Ireland for a little over 3 months. 2 years later, Madge would make the journey to the United States as a war bride, travelling to meet Harry with their Irish-born daughter Olive. Despite the brevity of their 1917 acquaintance, the couple appear to have made a life together. They ultimately settled in Niagara County, New York, where by 1930 their family had grown to encompass 3 daughters. The United States had become Madge's home, and she remained there even when Harry passed away in the late 1930s. Though she returned to Ireland at least once, in 1954, it was New York where she spent her later years, passing away in 1966. The arrival of the Americans in Cork had fundamentally altered the course of Madge's life, an alteration that saw her spend almost the last half-century of that life away from the country of her birth. In 1917, Madge Ring had been one of the first Irish women to marry an American sailor, but she was far from the last. Over the course of the conflict's final years, large numbers embarked on what was a doubly momentous step, committing themselves in one fell swoop to both married life and a new reality on the other side of the Atlantic. In 1919, thousands of war brides disembarked at American ports, often on specially designated ships from which they were, quote, discharged to the care of their husbands. They were generally welcomed to their new country, with organisations such as the Young Women's Christian Association particularly active in aiding them. The YWCA set up a bride welfare committee and went so far as to try to provide some of the women with official chaperones. By September 1919, it was estimated that 3,250 war brides had come to America from Europe since the armistice. By November 1917, the New York Times had been receiving reports that up to 100 marriages had already taken place in Cork, a story that was published widely not only in America, but also in Britain. Of all the nationalities represented among the brides, those from Ireland certainly seemed to be among the most popular. Barely 6 months after the majority of Americans had first set foot in Ireland, American newspapers were printing more detailed pieces about US sailors winning brides in, quote, sunny Ireland, a measure of how short a time they'd been here. One reported under the banner, "Love at first sight gets many." Every part of the United States has supplied a hero in love romances that has culminated in happy marriages between American bluejackets and blue-eyed Irish maidens since the arrival of the American destroyer forces in the south of Ireland. After the war, every part of the United States, from Maine to California and from the Great Lakes to Florida, will boast of an Irish bride who was wooed and won in her native land by an American sailor. Some newspapers went so far as to trumpet the superiority of the Irish bride over her European counterparts, though perhaps for somewhat less romantic reasons. The highest average of comeliness is among the Irish brides. Few of the girls are of the high heel variety, the majority having efficient acquaintance with household duties. The girls themselves are unanimous in pronouncing Americans persistent and gallant lovers. Much of the contemporary American coverage of war brides presents a fairy tale picture of wartime lovers struck by Cupid's arrow. Though romance was clearly a major factor in many of the Irish marriages, there are indications that there is a more complex story to tell about the interactions between local Irish women and the American Navy, and about some of those who went so far as to marry a Jack Tar. As we've discussed, an examination of the relationships between Irish women and American sailors during the First World War cannot be divorced from an appreciation of the social realities that faced them during this period. This is particularly true of Cork, where the majority of American sailors were based, and from where the majority of Irish war brides eventually hailed. Far from the romantic idyll of some of the American reports, there was often intense social disapproval of liaisons between local women and the newcomers. The root causes of these tensions have been ably examined in Dr. John Borgonovo of UCC's Irish Historical Studies paper on Cork women, American sailors and Catholic vigilantes in 1917-18. Among them were religious morality, cultural differences, political opposition to the war, and jealousy towards the popularity of the exotic and relatively well-paid American servicemen. It wasn't long before the faithful at Sunday Mass in St. Colman's Cathedral, Queenstown, were hearing the sailors being described as vultures who were preying upon the purity of our daughters. Soon, crowds largely made up of young men were taking matters into their own hands. In early September 1917, boiling point was reached in Cork City and violence erupted. The cause, according to the Freeman's Journal, was the, quote, attitude of American sailors towards young girls. The paper reported what happened. On Sunday night, jeering crowds followed them, the Americans, through the streets. Last night, further hostility was shown towards the sailors, and on Merchant's Quay, a row developed in which some of the Navy men were somewhat injured. A party of sailors proceeding to Glanmire terminus were followed by a large crowd, who indulged in jeering and hissing. At the railway bridge, the police interfered and drove the crowd back to King Street. At the Coliseum, an American accompanied by a female was attacked and a window in the building was broken. A crowd of youngsters, with a Sinn Féin flag crossing Patrick's Bridge, were charged by the police with batons and driven into the side streets. The disorderly conduct continued up to 11 o'clock, when the people dispersed. The Freeman's Journal report failed to include that it had not just been the Americans who had been set upon, but also the local women who were accompanying them. One of those women was Madge Ring, who had been with a sailor coming back from the theatre when some local men blocked their path and told them they could go no further. When the couple attempted to flee the scene, Madge was struck in the eye, an injury which she claimed caused her to lose her employment. Another Cork woman, Rose Blackshields, was hit in the mouth during the same incident, while Madge McCrohan said she was beaten by the crowd. At the inquiry held into the incident a number of weeks later, Madge Ring was asked, "Notwithstanding all the beatings you have got, would you go with the American sailors again?" She replied, "Sure I would," to which the crowd laughed. The questioner noted how Cork was a scandal at this time, as you could see bands of girls waiting for American sailors, while the prosecution noted that there was not a scintilla of evidence for these allegations of immorality against the girls. The theme of violence towards women who were willing to liaise with the Americans was something that would continue. On one occasion, the newspapers reported on an incident in Queenstown. Last Sunday afternoon, about 200 girls of flapper type who arrived by train from Cork were met by a crowd of about 50 youngsters, street urchin types, the eldest not over 17, armed with sticks and stones, and chased back to the station where they boarded the next train. Some girls had their hats and dresses torn off. The United States Navy responded to the violence against their men by banning their servicemen from Cork City for the duration of the war. The whole affair left a bitter taste that was not easily forgotten, least of all by their commander, Admiral Sims. One naval observer, R.B. Payne, wrote in mid-1918, "When it came to fraternising with the Irish natives of the port, the American sailor suffered disillusions, and his views of conditions, political and social, were radically changed. There were hundreds of Irish Americans on the destroyers. One could not imagine a fighting ship without them. But they, too, lost much of that sympathy for downtrodden, martyred Ireland, which had been absorbed at home. It would be foolish to gloss the situation over. The American fleet was insulted, jeered, and regarded as a hostile force because it had sailed across the sea to help England in the common cause against the enemy. This attitude was naturally resented. Nor did it help matters when publicly from the pulpit of the cathedral these officers and sailors were denounced as dissolute ruffians who had invaded Ireland like vultures, ready to corrupt the young men and ravish the young women. Such monstrous falsehoods as these were commonly believed. The historical evidence suggests that many local Irish women who entered into relationships with American sailors risked social repercussions, and as we've seen, they sometimes risked physical bodily harm. But beyond these broader statements, it's difficult for us to gain an insight into these women as individuals, and by progression to seek to ask broader questions about their lives and choices. In an attempt to bridge that gap, my work has concentrated on examination of two principal record sets housed in the US National Archives: American emergency passport applications and the passport applications of wives and members of the AEF in Europe. Analysis parameters were established which resulted in the identification of 99 Irish women who could be placed in one of three categories: the wives of US naval personnel, the wives of US Army personnel, and Irish-born women who had entered the United States service. The vast bulk of these women, 73 in total, had married members of the Navy. Although this is far from a complete list of all the Irish women who wed American sailors, it is nonetheless a sizable sample to examine. To begin with, the passport applications themselves carry a range of information that can be used as a baseline for further analysis. Among the detail the forms contain are the date of birth of the applicant, their nativity, the names and nativity of their parents and husband, the occupation of their husband, the intended date and vessel of their travel to America, and their intended residence once they arrived in the United States. In addition, data is also provided on whether or not they'd been to the United States before, and if they'd ever lived outside Ireland at any time. The forms also detail the US consulate where the application was made, and perhaps most strikingly, each of the form also carries a photograph of the woman involved. What is immediately apparent upon examining the group is their age profile. Of the 73 women, only 3 were over 30 years of age. The majority were in their late teens or early 20s. Almost 56% of the group were under the age of 22. Nearly 91% under the age of 25. In terms of geographical spread, there was at least one marriage that could be associated with every base in Ireland where Americans were present. Unsurprisingly, the greatest concentration was in County Cork, where 50 of the women were from. Taking a closer look within the county, Cork City dominated with 18, followed by Queenstown with 13 and Youghal with 4. Using the applications, it is also possible for us to see where the women intended to make their homes in America. And unsurprisingly here, there's a noticeable concentration on the East Coast and in major cities. What type of socio-economic circumstances were the women from? Drawing on the 1911 census, it was possible to identify the families of 45 of them and assess the occupations of the heads of household. What is apparent here is that they came from a wide range of backgrounds. Some were from the poorer levels of society, the daughters of labourers or painters. But there was also a significant number from families who may have been more engaged in the war effort than the average. 5 were identifiable as the daughters of RIC constables. Another 3 the daughters are current or former British military servicemen. 6 of the women were the daughters of men who worked in the maritime trade, as either pilots, seamen or shipping foremen. The children of the middle classes are also represented. Among the war brides we find the daughters of an advertising agent, a dividend broker, and a press correspondent. To date, it has only been possible to identify the occupation of the women themselves in 3 instances, but it revealed that 2 worked as dressmakers and 1 was a vest maker. What of the potential motivations behind the marriages? Here it's apparent that in many, if not most of the matches, romance played a key role. But a number of the unions were surely hastened by the fact that pregnancy had occurred outside of wedlock, a fact demonstrable by the date of birth of a couple's child relative to their date of marriage. The stigma of becoming pregnant while unmarried would have been extreme in rural Ireland at this time. It may have been a factor which caused a number of Cork women to move to England prior to their passport application, rather than submitting their petitions at the consulate in Queenstown. Perhaps the most fascinating group to emerge from among the passport war brides are what appears to be multiple instances of friends and sisters all marrying Americans. Letitia Collins and Annie Cronin from Youghal both married sailors in Queenstown, and both stood as witnesses for the other's application, suggesting that they were friends. From among the American Army wives, Dublin sisters Sheila and Christine Brooks both married Doughboys within a month of each other at the Knotty Ash embarkation camp near Liverpool. Madge Ring, the Cork woman who had been attacked on the street in 1917, made good on her promise to go with an American by marrying one in 1919. Census analysis suggests that Ellen Ring, who had married a sailor 6 months earlier, may well have been her sister. Similarly, Mary Blackshields, who was the sister of Rose Blackshields, one of the other women assaulted that night in Cork, married a sailor of the USS Panther in 1918. Yet another potential double marriage can be found in Bridie and Margaret Sullivan from Bantry, who both appear to be the daughters of a local publican. Both of them married in England, and both applied for their passports through the London consulate. Bridie was also one of the women who had become pregnant out of wedlock. Such is the apparent frequency of this phenomenon that it raises interesting questions, including whether at least part of the motivation for marriage was an opportunity to start a new life in the United States. While we can look at this information to provide us with analytical data, ultimately it's the personal stories of these women that is the most captivating. And I want to conclude the podcast by briefly exploring one of them, the story of Mollie D. from Youghal. Mollie Josephine D. was born in Youghal on the 14th of March 1900, where her father, a carrier, had the family home on Kenny's Lane. Following the arrival of the Americans, Mollie met Eugene Clark, a native of Floyd County, Iowa, and a first-class gunner's mate aboard the USS Shaw. The couple wed in early 1918, and before long Mollie was expecting their first child. While she prepared for the birth in Cork City, Eugene continued his duties on the western approaches. At 6:45 a.m. on the 7th of October, an after billboard on the Shaw was torn loose by heavy seas, and Eugene was sent to fix it. As he did so, the Iowan was caught by a wave, washed overboard, and drowned. A decision was taken by the Navy not to break the news to Mollie straight away. A cablegram preserved in the National Archives in Washington, D.C., dated to the 25th of October 1918, records, "Next of kin, wife Josephine Clark, 13 Smith Street, Cork, now critically ill. We will inform her as soon as her condition warrants." The critically ill reference was to Mollie's childbirth. 2 weeks after her husband had drowned, on the 21st of October 1918, Mollie gave birth to their daughter, Mary Josephine Jean Clark, unaware of what had befallen her husband. We know from Mollie's passport application that she had never been outside of Ireland. But despite her husband's death, she nonetheless took the courageous decision to emigrate to the United States anyway. In 1919, she and her daughter sailed the Atlantic, bound for 110 Linden Avenue in Waterloo, Iowa, and a mother-in-law that she had never met. Her arrival occasioned mention in the local press. Adams County Free Press reported on the 10th of May 1919, "Mary Josephine Clark and her 6-month-old baby boy," it was actually a baby girl, "reached Waterloo to make the parents of her late husband a visit. The baby is the only grandchild, and the little fellow and his mother, a well-educated Irish girl, received an enthusiastic welcome in the Clark home. But Eugene will never return." The newspapers had more to report on the 8th of November that year, when Mollie married her late husband's brother, Harry, in Waterloo. The couple went on to have children of their own, but by 1930 Mollie was recorded as divorced, though still living with her parents-in-law in Waterloo. Mollie appears to have died in the United States during the 1970s. Her Cork-born daughter, Mary Josephine Jean, passed away in Iowa in 2010, a reminder of just how close in history these events are. An examination of the experiences of Irish war brides during the First World War offers us an opportunity to explore some of the wider social and political issues that were current during this period of Irish history. It also serves as a reminder of the far-reaching, often life-changing impact of conflict on a wide and varied group of people, many of them non-combatants, and many of them at extreme geographical remove from the decisions which so impacted them. Surely, none of these war brides could have fathomed how President Woodrow Wilson's declaration of war in April 1917 would alter the course of their lives. For their part, It must have taken considerable courage to embark on the very daunting step of seeking a new life across the ocean. Their stories and experiences are certainly ones that deserve to be explored and remembered. If you're interested in seeing images of the war brides, I have a travelling exhibition that's currently on display in Spike Island in Cork. Please remember to follow along with the podcast or subscribe to the YouTube channel and the website if you'd like to keep up to date with new material. If you'd like to support the work that I do and gain access to exclusive content, you can do so at my Patreon site at www.patreon.com/IrishACW.